In this video, we'll take a look at some of our types of eukaryotic organisms. I've already discussed a little bit about the eukaryotes in terms of their study in the field of microbiology, and we've talked about the structure of eukaryotic cells. So now we'll take a closer look at some of these eukaryotic organisms. So if we look at the eukaryotes, we know that they are a very diverse group. We have unicellular eukaryotes with the algae and the protozoans. We have multicellular eukaryotes with our helminths or our parasitic worms and fungi, and also, of course, plants and animals. So the eukaryotes are a hugely diverse group, and we'll spend a few minutes now just going through and looking at some of these. So our first group that we'll look at are the protists. Now remember I told you that the protists are kind of like nature's junk drawer. That the protists are not a phylogenetic group. They're the catch-all group for eukaryotes that aren't fungi, plants, or animals. And so in this group of protists, we have the algae and protozoans. Okay. And so when we look at algae, we tend to think algae are more of our plant-like unicellular eukaryotes, and then our protozoans are the animal-like unicellular um, protists. They inhibit a wide variety of habitats. Protozoans can be both aquatic and terrestrial. They can be free living. They can be parasitic. So they can live pretty much anywhere. Now, we'll get into specifics about their life cycle later on when we start discussing specific diseases and specific organisms that cause disease. But for now, when we talk about their life cycle, it's a fairly complicated life cycle in some respects. Um, During their feeding stage or their growth stage, they are called trophozoites. So tropho means food or feeding. So trophozoite is the stage in the life cycle where they're actively looking for food, actively growing, metabolizing. Now, some protozoans only exist in this trophozoite form, but others can develop into cysts. Cysts are the protozoan equivalent of the bacterial endospore. These cysts allow the protozoans to be able to survive when conditions may not be favorable, when they don't have ready access to the food or environment that they need. The reproduction of protozoans can also get very complicated. Some reproduce asexually, some reproduce sexually, some can do both. They can have asexual and sexual reproduction. And we'll talk more about those specific parts of the life cycle when we get to our specific parasites. But one of the ways that they can reproduce asexually is through a process called schizosony. And in schizosony, the nucleus actually divides before the cell divides. And when this occurs, we get what are called merozoites. And you basically get a lot of these little immature forms that are stored up in these structures, and then they'll release all at once. And so then all of those protozoans will be released into the environment, whatever that environment happens to be. So in terms of, similarities, when we look at the different groups of protozoans, we really don't necessarily see a lot of similarities. They are widely different in where they live and how they live. Some protozoans have flagella, some have cilia that they use for movement, some can move through what we call pseudopods, which are extensions of the cytoplasm that they kind of extend and kind of move, kind of like an inchworm or a caterpillar. Um, some protozoans have contractile vacuoles, which allows them to take water and move it in and out of the cell for osmotic regulation. So they're so different. You really have to consider each individual group of the protozoans to start to see some similarities between them. Now, if we look at the classification or the grouping of our protists, you're going to see them scattered all across domain Eukarya. Remember, they're not a single phylogenetic group because they don't have a common ancestor. So we classify them kind of the best way we can into different groups. And the sections here kind of go through some of these groups, the amoebozoa, which are the protozoans that move by amoeboid movement or by the use of those pseudopods. And again, they have different types of life cycles and different, reproductions. We have the supergroup Chromalveolata, and this includes the apicomplexans, the ciliates, the diatoms, and the dinoflagellates, which are often grouped with the algae. So again, as you read through and you look at these different groups that we have, you'll notice it's really hard to classify our different protists. Again, that's why we call them nature's junk drawer, because they're so different. Okay. So I'll leave you to read through the different types of protists and different classifications there for those. Now, if we move to our parasitic helminth, so we've gone from our protists, from protozoa, now jumping over and looking at the helminths, which are the parasitic worms. So parasitic worms are in the animal kingdom. They are animals. And remember, we study them in microbiology because certain parts of their life cycle, their egg stage and their larval stage, are microscopic and they cause significant diseases in humans. So it does make sense to discuss them in the field of microbiology. Now, when we look at the parasitic worms, we have several different groups of them. We have the nematodes, which are the round worms. And the one that we'll talk mostly about is Ascaris lumbricoides, so that's a round worm. Then we have the platyhelminthes, or the flat worms. These include the flukes and the tapeworms, which can be parasitic, and also the planarians, which are never parasitic. We've never had an example of a parasitic planarian. Here's an example of a fluke here. Here's an example of a tapeworm here. Here's the mouthpiece of a tapeworm, and we'll talk more about these as we get on into the semester and talk about specific pathogens. Fungi. Fungi are considered in microbiology not just because we have, pathogens that are fungi, but also a lot of our food. And in fact, a lot of our ecosystems are built upon fungi. So fungi are heterotrophic, meaning they depend on other sources for their nutrition. There are, macroscopic forms of fungi, the molds and mushrooms, but we also have the microscopic forms, the yeast and then the spores that are released. So fungal diseases are called mycoses. So anytime you see this mica, or generally anytime you see this myco here, or mycosis or mycoses, that is something to do with a fungus. Now, fungi have some characteristics that do set them apart. If we look at the multicellular fungi, the molds, they're made up of these individual filaments called hyphae. That's what those little hair-like structures are that you can see. That's what makes molds kind of furry. Those are called hyphae. And then, of course, the yeasts are the unicellular. Some fungi are what we call dimorphic, meaning that they can have more than one appearance. Sometimes they can appear to be yeasts, or sometimes they can appear to be molds. And this allows fungi to be able to survive in very diverse environments. Fungi also have several reproductive capabilities. They can reproduce both sexually and asexually, depending on whether they're dimorphic or we're looking at yeasts or molds. There are 7 major groups of fungi. Not all of them contain pathogens, and we'll really restrict our study to the most common fungal pathogens of humans, but there are a lot more that are pathogens of plants and can do damage to crops and lead to famines. So they can be economically important in that respect, but we're not going to focus our study on them so much as we are the human pathogens. Now, algae are also protists, but they are the plant-like protists. We consider them to be plant-like because they are autotrophic. They are photosynthetic. They have different types of pigments, different types of chlorophyll where they can make their own food. They are very ecologically important. They make up the basis of food webs and food chains. They produce about 70% of the oxygen and organic matter in aquatic environments. So they are very important. In terms of microbiology, we're not really going to talk a lot about the algae, except for those that do cause harm to humans. Those will be our toxin-producing algae. We have a particular type of algae called dinoflagellates that can produce a red tide or a harmful algal bloom. And one of your video assignments that you'll complete will be about red tides. Another interesting type of algae are the diatoms, which have cell walls made of silica, so they look like glass. When you look at a slide that has diatoms, it almost reminds me of like a kaleidoscope. They're all different shapes, all different sizes, all different structures. So, and they're really pretty to look at. The last section here with the eukaryotes is about lichens. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between 2 organisms, either a green alga or cyanobacterium plus a fungus, and they live together basically in harmony. It can be typically a mutualistic relationship. Lichens can be found on any surface. I mean, you've seen lichens. They grow on rocks, they grow on trees. And so lichens are a very interesting ecological phenomenon because you have 2 completely different organisms that live in 100% harmony with one another in this mutualistic relationship.